MPs face pressure to legalise cannabis after the announcement came yesterday that Germany was the third European Union member to legalise the drug for personal use after Malta and Luxembourg.
Yeah, members of the public will be allowed to openly carry 25 grams of cannabis, hold 50 grams at home and cultivate a maximum of 3 plants. But should the UK follow in the same direction? It's a question that's been around for a very long time. And with us in the studio to talk about this is Nick Pateras, who is a medical cannabis expert, and Ed Davis, who's policy director at the Centre for Social Justice. Good morning to you both. Really good to see both of you. Should we just start with the pros and cons? Why should we even consider using cannabis? Because it does have some really good properties.
It does, and I think that the starting point for this debate is really around acknowledging that the policy of prohibition has been a failure, that the market hasn't gone away. In fact, it's growing at an increasing rate since cannabis and all of the compounds were thrown into this sin bin 50 years ago. And so we now have to acknowledge that youth access continues to rise, that regulation is really the responsible way for us to address the public safety and health issues around this topic.
Interesting. And Ed, you would oppose that?
Yes, very much so, yeah. I suppose, I mean, coming from right back to basics, why do we prohibit cannabis now? It's because it's a harmful substance. It's because it's associated with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, psychosis, mental health.
Well, very strong cannabis.
Yeah.
It's skunk cannabis is, but lower doses of cannabis, and I'm speaking as a medic, have really beneficial effects for certain medical conditions.
So, and it's about, sorry, I was about to carry on there. It's not just these things. So there are associations at all levels, particularly depression in young people and later suicidal effects.
Yeah.
Really good studies on that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There is an association, however little. But then there's also the added thing. So at the moment, the other things that I work on in my work, working poverty, is children missing school. There's a huge link with cannabis and failure at school. I work on economic activity and some of the drivers of that, which look at mental health problems in young people. Again, is this the way that we solve mental health problems in young people?
But we wouldn't be legalising it for young children. It would be for adults.
Doing it for young people. We would see an increase in that sort of 18 to 24 bracket. And certainly this idea that prohibition hasn't worked, every single survey ever done of people saying, would you use it if it was legalised, suggests that they would. And there are lots of countries where it has been legalised that has seen increases, particularly in young people.
But isn't there a difference between, yes, somebody saying, yes, I would use it perhaps recreationally, once in a blue moon on a special occasion, and somebody who would become addicted to it?
Yes. I mean, first we have to acknowledge that cannabis is not an entirely benign substance. Yeah. There is a risk for a small group of consumers that it can be habit-forming, but it's a low risk and it's for a small group. And I would contend that actually, when you regulate, the studies demonstrate that youth access actually goes down. We've seen that across the US states that have legalized adult use access, as well as Canada. High school students find it harder to access cannabis after legalization, and their consumption rates actually decrease because it becomes harder.
Can we just go back to the idea about prohibition? And you said something quite intriguing. The reason we do this is because it's dangerous. The reason we do it is because the politics dictate we do it. When you look at the drug classification, those classes are ridiculous. The cannabis is in Class B. There are certain drugs that shouldn't be in classes. David Nutt, who was the professor at the time, said this classification is wrong, it needs to change. And what did they do? He was the head of the advisory, a committee on advisory for the misuse of drugs. What did they do? They fired him.
They did. I mean, the classification of drugs is a slightly different question. We get into the weeds over the different classifications for the different kinds of drugs, and so to speak, and the way you do that. But I think the reason that you're right that it is political is actually politicians, to be fair to them, they see this in their constituencies, and particularly if you go into deprived areas and go onto the tough housing estates and you see what is going on, you don't see lives that are full of hope. You see that this is actually driving a lot of problems.
But is it cannabis that we're seeing in those deprived communities, or is it harder drugs? Because in my experience, it tends, yes, cannabis, certainly, but other drugs too.
Cannabis is certainly the most widely used, yes.
Nick?
And well, I would actually say that the picture that Ed's painting is actually an argument for regulation. The picture that Ed's painting is a result of the current system of prohibition. We have a system whereby there is a market. It's not for us to determine whether or not cannabis will be available in this country, because it is. And so it's actually government's responsibility to protect people from substances that can be harmful, but actually for many people are used responsibly. And I think it's the moral, ethical choice to keep the market that's already established out of the hands of criminal enterprise.
And are we talking here about decriminalisation or legalisation? I understand there's sometimes a difference in the way that those two things are defined, because we don't want to see, I think many people would think that prisons being full of people who are dealing weed or smoking weed or have possession of cannabis, it's just not the right use of our prison spaces. And if we were to decriminalise it, that wouldn't happen.
Well, at the moment, I mean, our prisons are in a complete mess on drugs. You have some prisons that where people are going in clean and coming out with a serious drug addiction. And that comes back to when you make drugs available, they are addictive. About 1 in 10 people that take cannabis will develop an addiction. And that's a high number.
Is it right that people are having criminal records for simply possessing a drug like this?
Well, yes, because it's illegal.
So, well, it's...
But that ruins their, you know...
In many ways, that's chicken and egg. But let's just go back to your point, Nick. How would you address that? So I think your point is that if you tightly control the market, you regulate it, first of all, people who take it know what they're taking. They know the strength of what they're taking. We can also raise revenue on the back of that to pay for things like the health service or indeed drug misuse centres. Isn't there an argument to say prohibition has failed, and we need to have a grown-up conversation about how we move this forward?
So there is nowhere in the world that has managed to wipe out the illicit market. Sometimes they've halved it, sometimes it's 2/3. But the idea that by regulating it, we get rid of the illicit market has been proven false. But also, I mean, we did a round table with half a dozen drug dealers and said to them, if we legalise cannabis, will this put you out of a role? And they laughed at us because what they do is they come with a whole range of drugs. Different things, different strains. And so people will not just go to the regulated market. What you will find is wealthy people who want to feel good about themselves will go to the regulated market, and the kids on the estate, the people who can't afford the regulated, highly taxed market, they will keep taking what they were taking from unregulated illicit.
Do you think, Nick, finally, if we can just ask you, do you think this argument is moving on? It feels to me that every country is moving in this direction. Are we likely to move in that direction, do you think?
I think eventually it's inevitable. I think it'll take some time because I think certain countries need to play the guinea pigs. But when you look at countries like Canada or states across the US, markets in which I've worked, the data is very clear. These policies take time to settle in, but they are successful.
Certainly a very fascinating debate and one we'll continue to have, I'm sure.
Feisty as well.
Very feisty. Thank you so much.